Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Cisco Optics podcast, where we talk about optics for networking. Have you ever wondered why pluggable optics exist? Have you ever wondered what acronyms like QSFP, LR4, FEC, and PAM4 actually mean? My name is Pat Chow, and I'm a product manager in the Cisco Optics group. In this first episode, I start a conversation with my colleague, Ray Nearing. He explains to me how a lot of these came to be, starting from the days of 1 gigabit GBIC, all the way up to today's 400 gig QSFP DD. Now, this is the first part of a 4-episode conversation with Ray. In this episode, we start at the beginning with GBIC and SFP. He also talks about why pluggables were needed when they started and a whole bunch more. Check out the notes section for a detailed breakdown. Ray Nearing is a colleague of mine in the Cisco Optics Product Management Group, and over the years has held senior management positions at other companies in the optics space, such as AT&T Microelectronics, Lucent, JDSU, Agere, Optium, and Lightwire. So much deep experience, I think he knows what he's talking about. For more information about Cisco Optics, go to cisco.com/go/optics and check out our blogs at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics blog with no spaces and no hyphens. You can find our YouTube playlist by going to youtube.com and searching on Cisco Optics. And if you find this podcast helpful or interesting, subscribe and give us a review on Apple Podcast, formerly known as iTunes. We're also on Spotify, Google, Amazon, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and a bunch more. And now, join me as I talk with Ray Nearing. Hey, Ray, how are you doing?
Good. Hey, Pat, what's going on?
Not too much. Hey, thanks so much for kicking off our first podcast ever.
Well, I'm happy to be a guinea pig.
Well, I'm a guinea pig along with you. All right. So, we talked many times about pluggable optics. This is our business. This is what we do, right? Now, you have the advantage that you've been doing this longer than I have. I remember that when I first joined our group, I've been educated in like the physics of optics and stuff, right? But the pluggables as a business is its own thing. And I was totally overwhelmed with all the nomenclature, the history, and just the form factors and the specs. And because it seems like there's always like a story behind it. It's not something you can just look at the name and figure it out. Because I would look at these names and acronyms and be like, what does that mean? And like, there is no way you could figure it out on your own. You just have to ask somebody or read an article. You just have to know it. So I thought people out there, hopefully listening to this now, would benefit from hearing some of these stories. So I thought, since QSPDD is kind of the big thing right now, I would ask you in general, how did we get here? How did we get to QSPDD? Like, where did it start? What kind of decisions were made in the industry that eventually brought us to this point? And I know that may be like asking a lot, but I've got the recorder turned on. We've got a lot of time. Just go ahead and start wherever you'd like to start.
Well, I think that one place to start off is as close to the beginning that I know about, and that's really how did pluggable optics start in general? And if I remember correctly, that what had happened in what I believe is the beginning was really GBIC was probably the first pluggable optic module that was out there. But I think the one that was really successful was the SFP. And that was primarily for 1 gig. And it was a small form factor, had a 1 gig SerDes going in and out of it in a single lane. And the idea was, and I think Cisco was really pushing pretty hard on this, was to have something that was multi-sourceable and a lot of flexibility around, what kind of reach you would get and what kind of interface there was, and whether or not it could be a copper cable or an optical module or whatever it might be. And I think the other thing that was in combination with that was the various ASICs that were available. So I think if you go back maybe to the late 90s or early 2000 timeframe, there were ASICs that might have like, 40 gigabits of, or maybe even less, a few gigabits of bandwidth. And, essentially, people wanted pretty flexible interfaces on those cards. So, you were able to have a device that, if you wanted it to be short reach, it could be a short reach connection or a long reach connection or even a copper cable connection, and provided that flexibility. I think the other thing that it provided was the ability to be multi-sourced and be able to leverage sort of the core competencies of various players in the marketplace, and that there would also be competition between them, and also provide the flexibility of managing the supply chain for volume and spikes and that type of thing in your sales.
Okay, so I think I heard a lot of things that maybe some people listening might not be totally familiar with. So if I could ask you to go into a little more detail. So you mentioned multi-vendor, which you just talked about a little bit. SerDes you mentioned.
Yes.
ASIC. And just the fact that it's pluggable. Like, what was around in optics before pluggable?
Well,
optics was around, right?
Yeah, so the modules that were around were basically modules that you would mount directly onto your printed circuit board inside the switch or router. And so those ports were dedicated to, whatever that optical interface was. Mm-hmm. So if it was a short reach type of part, there'd be an optical connector on the front panel. And there were MSAs around those form factors as well, except you had to decide what was actually going to be on that line card or in that box, and the type of connection you were going to make to it.
And so why is that a problem? What's the problem that pluggables is solving?
Well, it gives you the flexibility not to have to decide what that interface had to be when you manufactured it. It gave you the option to be able to use that box or that line card in a number of different applications. So if the connections were very, very, very short, you could use optics that were a pluggable optic that was dedicated for short reach type connections that was maybe only, a few meters away, or something that might be several kilometers away, depending on how you wanted to use it. So your box, the actual box or line card itself, would always be the same, and the flexibility would be around what was the thing you were plugging into it.
And why is this flexibility so important? Like, why is it important that you want to be able to select the distance after you actually buy the line card?
Well, I think at that time, and even today, the reach of that type of module depends on the type of media that you want to go across, whether it's, let's say, multi-mode or single mode fiber, and the cost of those things.
The cost of the transceivers varies quite a bit depending on the distance.
Exactly. So longer reach devices generally are more expensive than shorter reach devices and so on. So, really gives you a lot of flexibility. So you can have one platform that you can manufacture, and then you can fine tune it to the application with the type of optic that you're actually going to plug into it.
And then at that time, when GBICs and SFPs were new, was the pay as you grow model, was that a big deal at that time, or is it just about the flexibility of choosing the?
Well, pay as you grow was also a big part of it.
Type.
So, so pay as you grow was also a big part of it. So, the more expensive optics, obviously, for longer reach applications, you may need that in some applications and not others, and you may not necessarily fill all the ports that are in a line card. So as you put that product into your network, maybe adding on other types of functions in that network, and then you can plug in more devices as needed. So you're not buying something that you're not going to use. So in those dedicated platforms where all of the optics were sort of preloaded into it, you were paying for those optics whether you're going to use them or not. So the idea here is, well, you pay for the optic when you need it.
Okay, now getting back to some of the technical terms, SerDes and ASIC. Can you just briefly define at a high level what you mean?
So the ASIC is the IC that's managing all the switching on the platform. So whether it's a router or an Ethernet switch, there's basically the brains behind it that's managing all that traffic. And so that's the thing that sits inside the platform itself. That all of these optical connections or whatever they might be are connected to. And it decides where the traffic is going to be routed, depending on what's inside the packets in that traffic.
So it's the heart or the engine of the switch or router.
Exactly.
Right. And it's what what another switch has to connect to ultimately through some cable.
Correct. Or to a server or whatever else it may be connected to.
Right. Okay. How about SerDes?
Well, SerDes is the electrical interface, essentially the direct connection that the physical interface that's coming from that brain or from that ASIC to the outside world, and it's basically the high speed connection between the module itself and that ASIC. So back then the SerDes were operating at 1 gigabit, and that was pretty common, and that's why SFP and GBIC were 1 gigabit, started off as 1 gigabit modules.
So basically the actual traces on the PCB that lead from the pluggable port to the ASIC would be carrying this 1 gigabit data?
Yes.
All right. Now you said GBIC was first, but SFP was really the more successful one? I'm not sure if you used successful, but...
Well, I would say that GBIC was pretty common early on, but the nice thing about the SFP was that it was smaller, so it gave you the ability to go to higher density patch panel or front panel.
Okay, and why is that important? Density on the patch panel.
Well, you want to be able to connect to as many things as possible, and that ASIC, initially may have been relatively low bandwidth. But over time, as technology evolved, the bandwidth of that ASIC would get larger and larger, and so you want to be able to have more connections off of that front panel to other switches or servers or whatever it might be.
To utilize the full bandwidth of the ASIC. Yeah,
and also to have a broader utility for that particular product. So if you in your data center, as your data center grows, you're going to need more connections to that data center. So, or to that ASIC. So you have more connections in your data center that you're trying to go from, let's say, a stack of servers. How many servers are going to be in a rack, to that TOR, that top of rack switch that sits on top of it. Mm-hmm. And then there's a hierarchy of other levels that you're going to be connected to, so you can get to maybe other servers in that data center or connect to other data centers in your network.
So we started with GBIC, went to SFP, we're at 1 gig. The SerDes was also at 1 gig. That was the first part of my conversation with Ray Nearing, my colleague from Cisco Optics. Thanks so much for joining us. Next time we'll get into 10 gig pluggable optics. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. If you did, subscribe to this podcast. You'll get to hear the other 3 parts. Since it's a new podcast, we'd really appreciate you helping to get the word out. Share this with friends and colleagues that come to mind when you think of networking and optics. And leave a review on Apple Podcast, formerly known as iTunes. We're also on SoundCloud and the Cisco Podcast Network, and all major podcast platforms. Also, check out the Cisco Optics blogs at blogs.cisco.com and search on hashtag Cisco Optics blog with no spaces and no hyphens. We also have educational videos on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com and search on Cisco Optics. Thank you for listening. This is Pat Chow, Product Manager at Cisco Optics. The next episode is part 2 of my conversation with Ray Nearing. Until next time.